My YouTube channel. Today you can see Magnus Carlsen and Nakamura, two great legends match. Okay, let's start. Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to b4. As Nakamura pawn moves to e5. As Magnus Carlsen connect moves to f3. As Nakamura connect moves to c6. As Magnus Carlsen bishop moves to c4. As Nakamura connect moves to f6. As Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to d3. As Nakamura pawn moves to f6. Magnus Carlsen takes first position. Next, Nakamura bishop moves to c5. Next, Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to c3. Next, Nakamura pawn moves to d6. Next, Magnus Carlsen connect moves to pd2. Next, Nakamura takes first carlsen. Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to h3. Next, Nakamura bishop moves to b6. Next, Magnus Carlsen rook moves to e1. Next, Nakamura pawn moves to a5. Next, Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to a4. Nakamura bishop moves to e6. Next, Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to b3. Next, Nakamura rook moves to e8. Magnus Carlsen bishop moves to b5. Next, Nakamura bishop moves to d7. Next, Magnus Carlsen knight moves to c4. Next, Nakamura bishop moves to c5. Magnus Carlsen bishop moves to d2. Next, Nakamura bishop moves to a7. Next, Magnus Carlsen bishop is moves to c6 and Nakamura knight is killed. Next, Nakamura bishop moves to c6 and Magnus Carlsen bishop killed. Next, Nakamura knight moves to a5 and kill pawn. And Nakamura bishop moves to f2, check and kills the pawn. Okay. Next, Magnus Carlsen king moves to f2 and bishop is killed. Nakamura bishop. Next, rook moves to a5 and killed by knight. Okay. Next, Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to b4. Nakamura rook moves to a8. Next, Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to b5. Nakamura bishop moves to d7. Next, Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to c4. Nakamura pawn moves to c6. Magnus Carlsen king moves to g1. Nakamura bishop moves to e6. Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to a5. Next, Nakamura knight moves to d7. Magnus Carlsen king moves to h1. Next, Nakamura moves to b5 and Magnus pawn is killed. Next, Magnus pawn moves to b5. Nakamura pawn is killed. Okay, Nakamura knight moves to c5. Next, okay. Next, Magnus Carlsen rook moves to e3. Nakamura bishop moves to d7. Next, Magnus queen moves to b1. Nakamura knight moves to e6. Next, Magnus pawn moves to a6. Nakamura pawn moves to bx a6 and killed by Magnus pawn. Next, Magnus pawn moves to bx and a6 and killed by Nakamura pawn. Next, uh, next Nakamura knight moves to c5. Next, Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to a7. Next, Nakamura king moves to c7. Next, Magnus Carlsen king moves to e7, c7. Next, Magnus Carlsen king moves to a1. Next, Nakamura bishop moves to d5. Magnus Carlsen bishop moves to e3 and Nakamura knight moves to d3 and killed by pawn. Next, Magnus Carlsen rook moves to b1. Next, Nakamura bishop moves to c4. Magnus Carlsen cannot move to d3, and Nakamura pawn moves to d5, and Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to d5 and killed by Nakamura pawn. Next, Nakamura pawn moves to f5. Magnus Carlsen king moves to c3, and Nakamura pawn moves to e4. Next, okay. Next, Magnus Carlsen king moves to c4, and bishop is killed. Okay. Next, Nakamura king moves to g3. Next, Magnus Carlsen cannot move to f1. Next, Nakamura cannot move to f2. Check. Next, Magnus Carlsen bishop moves to f2, and Nakamura cannot is killed. Okay, and king moves to a3 and killed by rook. Okay. Next, Magnus Carlsen pawn moves to a6. Okay. Next, okay, pawn moves to a6. Sorry. Okay. Next, pawn moves to d6. Okay. Check. Okay. Next Nakamura king moves to h7. Next, Magnus Carlsen queen moves to d5. Nakamura pawn moves to f4, and Magnus Carlsen queen moves to f5. And check. The game is won by Magnus Carlsen.